Well, I was born in December 1938. This was during the great revolution of the Palestinians against the British. This revolution was raging from 1936 till 1938. And as a matter of fact, on that day, Ramallah was overrun by the Palestinian rebels. And the British, they had to use the Air Force. And many people were killed and injured. Some of them were transferred to Jerusalem hospitals, because at that time in Ramallah, there was not a single hospital of note capable of dealing with trauma patients. On that day, the idea of building a hospital evolved. And in 1943, few Ramallah elders, under the leadership of Aziz Shaheen, established the Ramallah Hospital Foundation and did the most important thing you can imagine. They bought large pieces of land in the northeast side of Ramallah, where right now the Ramallah Hospital and the Palestine Medical Complex are standing. Well, my earliest memories of Ramallah was when the British were there. During World War II, we noticed lots of British mobilizing their troops. Convoys of military trucks were passing through the city of Ramallah with soldiers of all different uniforms, some with Australian slouch, others with turbans from India, and also the Scotch with their typical dress. And we used to stand on the road waving for them, and they used to throw us packages of candy, and we used to run eagerly to collect them. But in Ramallah was itself controlled by the British, and there was this Captain Ford, who I remember used to walk around with his cane under his arm and pistol on his side, with his short and with his hat. And he was feared, and he made sure that everybody feared him. One time, I was coming back from the textile shop of my dad, and he looked at me and said, "Come on, boy." And I was so scared, ran home, sweating, and telling my oldest sister, who used to attend the French school, "Sister, you taught me the wrong word." "Why is that?" she said. "Well, you told me come on means come, ta'al. But Captain Ford told me come on, which means get the hell out of here." I did not She said, no, you misunderstood him. I indeed misunderstood him. I could not understand why Captain Ford would invite me for anything, because he was so feared. One day, do you want me to continue? One day, there was a group of Ramallah GIs who fought in North Africa and on the Italian front during World War II. They were on a furlough visiting Ramallah. And Captain Ford, as usual, entered a bar in Ramallah. It was a Ode bar. Like always, in his arrogant manner, and there was an verbal interaction between both sides, ended up that the GIs beat him up. And this spread all over Palestine of the heroism of these Palestinian young men protected with their American uniforms. It required at that time the diplomatic intervention of the American consul in Jerusalem to even this debacle between the two allied countries. My father was Khalil Harb. He owned a textile shop in Ramallah. He inherited from his father. The textile shop did very well, actually, and used to cater for villagers. And the villagers used to come to the shop and buy their wedding trousseaux. We used to call that kiswe. I remember they used to sit in a semicircle in front of the counter, and both relatives of the bride and the bridegroom, and they used to check the material with their fingers, and suggestions as to the quality came from all sides. And finally, they will carry that trousseau in their heads and walk singing to our house, where they most of the time will be fed, and they spend the night, and next morning they would leave. So that's my father. My older brothers, my oldest brother was Fuad, who used to work in Haifa in the seaport. And then I have another brother, Farid, who worked with the British, actually, in Jaffa. He was actually a mechanic, a car mechanic. And then Brother Nabi, who worked at the Palestine Broadcasting Service in Jerusalem. And he used to commute between Ramallah and Jerusalem on a daily basis. And then I have my oldest sister, Zahwe, and then also another sister, Mary. My oldest sister, Zahwe, is 94 years old, and she's doing very well. My other siblings, they all passed away.
Talk about your house. I lived in...
Yeah. Well, I was born in Aliyah. Aliyah is a home dwelling. Is made up of a storage area where mules and donkeys used to live, with an external stairway which leads to a terrace. The terrace was rather large, and on that terrace most of the invitations used to be held. Taking few steps, you go into the main dwelling area, made up of a large square hall with storage areas in the wall. All what you need is just to push the doors down, and you have the mattresses ready to sleep on. And during the night, we all slept on these mattresses. Our feet met in the middle. Inside that house, there was a stairway, a small stairway, which goes to the flat floor. And you have to use a ladder to go to the stairway. And from there, you go to the floor, which is surrounded by a 4 or 5 feet wall with windows, small windows, where you can look through these windows. And it was made after a long established Arabic type of architecture, which unfortunately you don't see anymore in Ramallah. But if you want to find how it looks like, look at the houses in Yemen. And as you know, the Ramallah people most likely originated from Yemen, and they immigrated after the Marib Dam exploded and came all the way up north till they settled in the Shawki area in South Jordan. My brothers early on immigrated to the United States. As a matter of fact, my father did also. And it seems he did not do well in the United States. He did better in his textile business. As a matter of fact, my granddad spent some time in the United States. It must have been in the late 19th century. But it was early enough to attend the World Expo in Chicago, which started in 1893 but lasted for at least 7 or 10 years. And he, being in the textile business, he actually exhibited some of his products in that expo. But it seems it did not last long, and then he worked in a steel factory in Bethlehem. He must have earned enough money to come back and marry, and also to add another story on the Aliyah in Ramallah, where I was born. He died, I think, in the same year when I was born, so I don't really remember him. But I remember his wife very well, who came from a village 70 miles north of Ramallah. It belongs to Lower Galilee. There was a teacher in Ramallah with the name of Ma'allim Shahadi, Master Shahadi. He used to go to a village called Azzoun, where my grandmother hailed, and teach, give some religion classes, because it was a small Christian community and they had no teachers. He used to go from Ramallah, give some religion classes and some Arabic and some math classes. But also he brought with him 4 brides who married 4 different Ramallites, including one of them, my grandfather. And their pedigrees are still around. My sister from Azzoun was an incredible lady. She was known to be extremely generous, especially towards the poor. And when my granddad died, she took over. She was a strong woman, and she managed his business and the affairs of the family till her death. When I grew up, we grew up in First World War II, and I would like to mention something about another experience in World War II when the Polish people came to Ramallah. In 1942, many Polish immigrants settled in Ramallah. They came from the Russian imprisonment. They were freed by Stalin so that they can join the Allied forces against the Nazis. And they were led by a general with the name of Stanislav Andrew, or Anders, as they call him. They came to Ramallah and they lived in Ramallah houses. They changed the economy of Ramallah. And suddenly you would see a blonde woman in Ramallah with notable absence of men. Their men were in the front. And they left their women and children in the trust and care of the Ramallah people. One of these families lived actually in our house. They, big houses usually have enough place for these immigrants to live. And this was Bogdan. Bogdan lived in our house for several years. And her son Bogdan was my age. This was an incredible and amazing experience. It changed the economy and also the cultural interaction. We never seen so many blonde people, especially women around us. Important sister, I think her name was Masha, I remember, Masha. She actually was single and attracted the attention of both bachelor and non-bachelors in Ramallah. The school system in Ramallah was affected by the political and military events. In 1948, during the war against the settler colonialist Zionists, the schools were closed. So we had no place to go to. The private schools were closed also. The only school which continued to function partially were the French schools. But this was partial, and also they were very expensive for the normal people to go to. Mostly it attracted people from outside of Ramallah. But slowly the government school opened, and then a Ramallah educator, Khalil Abu Raya, opened the first secular, non-sectarian school in Ramallah, which I joined. And this school attracted excellent teachers, and also the students were mostly from the villages around Ramallah and also from Ramallah. And for some reason, early in the 50s, many of my schoolmates were moved to the French schools. I don't know why I moved, but I know my cousin Ghassan was moved because he was politically very active. You know, at that time, the Cold War was raging, and the West was trying with all of its power to stop the expansion of communism. And it seems my cousin Ghassan was moved to the French school for the purpose of detoxification. He was very active politically. He was imprisoned by the Jordanian and also by the Israelis for 4 years, and actually tortured by them. And so it was a matter of detoxification. I spent several years at the French schools, which were exceedingly influential in my career. In these schools, I learned the value of free debate, of free thinking, and also the value of humans in general. The American teachers there, I remember them vividly, they very much influenced my career. My physics teacher, Crichton, was a great guide, and as a matter of fact, I thought I would study physics and mathematics. And indeed, these were my first steps when I went to college. But then I changed to medicine, luckily or unluckily. So I finished school in 1956, and unemployment was rampant. Poverty was pervasive. People were dependent mostly on aid from the United States. But the Ramallah people were particularly affected because they were not registered with the United Nations Relief World Agency. So they did not receive any help from the United Nations, in contrast to the refugees who came from the coast, from the Palestinian coast. For instance, my brothers, They all came from the coast, from Jaffa and West Jerusalem and Haifa. They refused to register as refugees. You know how the Ramallah people are. And they were all unemployed. It was very hard to survive at that time. So when I finished my high school in 1956, I was looking for a work, and I was lucky to find work at a newspaper in Jerusalem, the Palestine newspaper. My work at that time was to listen to news from all over the world in English and Arabic, write them down on a piece of paper, and give them to the chief editor. The editor will then change things and send them to press. And I had enough time, because my work was during the night, till 3 a.m. in the morning. After 3 a.m., I didn't know what to do. So I started to learn German at the German church in Jerusalem. And there was a German teacher who taught me German. And I was eager to learn the language. In a few weeks, I started translating from German into Arabic. And then there was a note, rumors that it is easy to study in Germany because you can work and at the same time study. Germany at that time was in the reconstruction phase after the war, and they needed a lot of workers. Me and another doctor, Isa Ziadeh, thought this is a good idea to go to Germany. Isa Ziadeh, the future mayor of Ramallah, he passed away. And indeed, we went both to Germany and started to study first language and to sit for math and physics and basic sciences exam. And then we got excellent grades, and we were admitted to the medical school. And from there, after I finished medical school, I moved to the United States, where I did first my surgery training, first in Massachusetts, then in Jacksonville, Florida. And then when I finished my surgery training, I went to Houston to my mentor, Michael DeBakey, where I trained in thoracic and cardiovascular surgery. And then I decided to go back home in 1975. That's when I went to Michael DeBakey and told him, "Sir, I'm planning now," bid him farewell. I told him I'm planning to go to Ramallah, go back. And this was the first time when I heard him utter a word in Arabic. He told me, "Inta majnoon." And DeBakey is of Lebanese background. He knew some Arabic, but this was the first time ever that I heard him talk in Arabic. And maybe I was majnoon. I heard the same word from my wife, Heidi, who's German. I told him, "Let's go to Ramallah." He said, "So majnoon." And we went to Ramallah. 1975, I joined the Ramallah hospital. As I said earlier, it was a small hospital. I was lucky to meet Aziz Shaheen, who encouraged me to stay. He was so happy to see a Ramallah boy come back and serve his country. And Aziz Shaheen was instrumental in building the 3rd floor of the hospital. When I was there, Ramallah Hospital had 75 rooms, but only 35 beds were in use. It was a legacy of the Jordanian rule. Now it is run by the Israeli military authorities. And to be employed, I had to have permission from the Israeli authorities and also from the Israeli security services. But I was employed, luckily. And in May 1st, 1975, I started my work in Ramallah. and it was lots of work. They used to send for hemodialysis patients to have access to Hadassah. And I started doing the access cases, simple cases. And finally, I expanded my work to do chest, but trauma was the focus of my work. Every day, we had injured Palestinians coming to the hospital, whether it was in their chests, their hearts, in their vascular system, and I had to operate on them. I remember later on when the Israeli-American physician Baruch Goldstein attacked worshippers at the Ibrahimi Mosque in February of 1994. It was a Friday. I entered the operating room on Friday afternoon. I went out of the operating room on Tuesday the next week, constantly working. All of the 35 injured in their chest who were referred to me, it was the only chest service in the West Bank, survived. As a matter of fact, one of them raised the flag on the Ramallah hospital in 1993 when the Palestinian Authority took over. One of these injured. Unfortunately, his injury rendered him paraplegic because it went into the esophagus and the trachea, which I had to repair, but it also affected his spine, which rendered him paraplegic. But he was able yet to raise the flag on his wheelchair with his arms. And things continued. When I was in Jacksonville, I'm going back a little bit, in 1970, the Jacksonville community was great help in supplying the Palestinians with the medical needs they required. As a matter of fact, in September 1970, the Jacksonville Ramallah community collected enough money to defray the expenses of a large field hospital, which I joined from Beirut to Irbid, Jordan, at a time when the civil war between the Jordanians and the Palestinians broke, and I had to operate under fire in the hospital. There was another Ramallahite with me, Dr. Laila Cassis. She was a pediatrician, and she did an amazing job. She would see 70 to 100 babies every day and treat them. You see, the government hospital was deserted, and we had to build a makeshift hospital in the refugee clinic there, which we succeeded in doing, and we treated a lot of injured. And I finished my training in Jacksonville, and then I went to do my heart surgery training in Texas. And that's when I landed in Ramallah in 1975, and I thought I'll stay for 2, 3, 4, 5 years at the most, and I stayed for 28 years. Then I decided in 2003 it became too difficult for us to come back to the United States. And I was lucky to be appointed as a senior surgeon in the Henry Ford Health System, where I worked till I retired in 2016, about 4 years ago. Clinically, I retired earlier. In 2013, I stopped doing surgery, but I was appointed then as a co-director of quality and safety. And also I was elected as the National Surgical Quality Improvement Program champion, surgeon champion of the American College of Surgeons. So I had too many things to do besides just doing surgery with my hands. And this enriched actually my horizon in the medical field, and as actually my thoughts how should be done to Ramallah hospital. Of course, I visited the hospital several times in the meantime, and I interacted with the staff and with the director of the hospital and with the ministers of health, and made my suggestions. And I know I recently was asked to join the medical mission. They are doing a great job. Dr. Rajai Khouri and Dr. Majid Hassan, and also Bajis Katwan and others. I'm sorry if I forgot some names. They are doing a great job, and we are trying to support them as much as possible. The problem still remains how much dysfunction the present Palestinian Authority has under its wings. And I tell you, there's a lot of dysfunction. And this reflects itself from the top hierarchy down to the lower echelons, including hospital employees and doctors. You know, we built hospitals in the past not according to modern systems. Nowadays, a hospital requires at least 1/3 of its space be dedicated to administrative. This is not the case in our hospitals. That's why employees, including doctors, they have a lot of contact with each other. Sometimes this leads to strife. I suggested to the Minister of Health when I was there 2 years ago that they should have, each specialist should have his own office and computer. Let him excel there. Let him have less contact with his colleagues and employees. Only official contacts should be. I don't know whether my suggestions were listened to, but I still will follow that suggestion, and maybe we'll be able to do it one day. Now, the Israelis, of course, was a colonial power, adamant at displacing the population. And when I say adamant, they used every means they have available to discourage people from staying in the occupied areas. It was not easy for me to stay. And I know many doctors were refused family reunion. Of course, I had my mother there who had an ID card, and I had a legal factor which made me stay. Besides, after I put the pacemaker in Ramallah, my name sort of spread. It was not easy for the Israelis to kick me out of the country. So finally, they gave me a family reunion. We treated all kinds of patients in the hospital, but Israelis were not allowed to be treated at the Ramallah hospital. One day, I was called in the middle of a curfew that we have an Israeli officer shot in the chest, and he is in critical condition and is bleeding to death. It was a curfew. So what shall I do? I put my headlights on and my flashlights and drove to the hospital. And indeed, I saw a terrified Israeli officer under Palestinian care. I operated on him, and he survived. He needed some blood transfusions. The Israelis did not know about him. And how was he shot? He was shot by an Israeli checkpoint. They thought it was a Palestinian car moving. And that's why they did not pay attention to him. He was brought to the hospital by the Palestinian Red Cross, Palestinian Red Crescent. And it was very interesting. When the Israelis knew, they surrounded the hospital with tanks, and they rushed with all kinds of doctors to the recovery room where that officer was lying with blood running in him. And the Israeli doctor was looking at the blood. One of my assistants told him, "This is Palestinian blood." He grinned. We all laughed. So this was one of these episodes. Of course, the Israelis took him away to another hospital. Another episode was, of course, when we had the mayors of Ramallah, Karim Khalaf, the mayor of Beirut, and the mayor of Nablus, bombed by Israelis. So this was in 1982. One day I was called to Ramallah, and there was Karim Khalaf, who was my classmate, by the way, the mayor of Ramallah, whose car protected him from being killed. But the bomb, which was implanted by a Jewish terrorist, succeeded in amputating his foot. Dr. Salti and Dr. Nader Khouri worked on his foot, and I helped them. This was more their specialty. And while I was helping them, I got a telephone call from Nablus, about 35 miles to the north of Ramallah, from the director of the hospital, that the mayor of Nablus, who was also bombed 3 days earlier, is in critical condition. Please come and help. So I put myself in the car. It was in the evening, and I drove to Nablus. Thousands of people were demonstrating in front of the hospital. So I made my way through the crowd into the operating room, into the actually recovery room first, where Mr. Shawki was lying. His vital signs were unstable. He had very high temperature. His pulse was very high. And the bombs the Israelis implanted under his car seat, succeeded in amputating both lower legs. Unfortunately, the surgeons there, in their hurry to treat him, they closed the stumps. 3 days earlier, this was when it happened. Unfortunately, he developed gas gangrene. And that's when I came to see him. No doctor likes to treat gas gangrene because the outcomes are not good in any center. And the Nablus hospital was not such a big center. So I suggested to him to transfer him urgently to an Israeli advanced center. He looked at me and said, "Shawki, I will stay in Nablus and I will die in Nablus." So I took him to the operating room. It was a matter of time, and I had to operate on him. The gangrene went all the way up to his pelvis, and I had to clean all of the dead muscle. He was very sick. And during the operation, the shouts of the demonstrators were reaching the operating room. And actually, some of them intruded into the operating room, including doctors with their regular clothes on. I was dismayed. But what dismayed me most was suddenly his heartbeat started to slow down and became very low to a point I thought we are going to lose him. Thank God he responded to the treatment, and we wheeled him out of the operating room with a big smile on his face, the signs of a good leader. And he survived to live many, many years later. Well, the Israelis were actually, one time they came to our house and they detained me. They knocked on the door and we opened the door. There were soldiers in front of the door. My wife, my German wife, standing behind me, and they asked me to come with them. Upon which my German wife told them, "Is this a Gestapo raid?" They grinned. Nevertheless, they took me. I stood in a square near our house, by the way. It was 3 a.m. in the morning. And there were other detainees. But they asked us to keep distance from each other and not talk to each other. And we stayed all day till the morning, and then they asked us to leave. When I came home, all the neighbors were waiting, including my wife, not knowing what's going to happen with me, but they were all happy when they saw me come back. So till now, I don't know. It's possible because the reason why they detained me, in 1982, I went on an ABC program called 2020 and talked about the occupation and the needs of the Ramallah hospital. It's possible this was just a scare tactic the Israelis used to instill fear among the population. This was one of their tactics, actually. A Human Shield, they will come to the hospital and search the hospital for wounded to arrest them. They think the wounded are the activists and they want to arrest them. And they will push me with the tip of their M16 to move into the operating rooms. I told them I cannot go, this is a sterile area. I cannot go, we have to change. And they kept pushing me. And indeed, I was forced to go in. This was one time. The other time when they came to my house and searched the house from one room to the other, and again with somebody pushing me with the tip of the M16. And this was scary because Israelis were known to shoot whether by mistake or non-mistake, and then claim that the detained tried to take the gun or to fight. And they did that with impunity. Nobody ever, checked for that. They would believe it. So I was scared when they pushed me with the tip of their guns. Yeah. Ramallah makes me sad for two things. First one, the large amount of buildings we are seeing. The building is expanding like a snake, nipping on the farmland. The farmland our ancestors used to have is shrinking by the day. And this makes me sad. The other thing which makes me sad, that so many Ramallites have left. But wait, what makes me happy and optimistic is the fact that I see people like you, first and second and third generation Palestinians from Ramallah, who are still so attached to their homeland and to the city. This in itself assures me that the colonialist settler project of the Zionist movement is ultimately going to fail. So I'm full of hope, and I'm sure many Ramallites and many Palestinians feel the same way.